Promised, we have a friend of mine of many years, Mike Wilkerson, who is, how do we even put this? Mike, I don't know how to describe, whenever I've known somebody for a long time, I have trouble describing them. You've had many decades in the financial world, and you are now doing political commentary, financial commentary. People can find you at stormwall.com, and you've been on the program before. You're the author. This is a great book you've written. It's called Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism. Highly recommended, folks, Why America Matters. But, Mike, I want to talk to you today about a lot of things. First of all, you put out a tweet about the Trump indictments and the most recent indictment. Why don't we, let's start there. And then at some point in the program, I want to talk to you about Barbie, which, folks, you're kind of not going to believe this. This is very sick, but it's worth knowing about. But let's start with the indictments.
Well, what was fascinating to me about this is it appears that the Democratic Party is doing exactly the opposite of what it should be doing. I mentioned that if you were sitting in, let's say, DNC leadership, you would say to yourselves, the last thing we want to do is keep the story of 2020 elections alive, the stolen elections. And in fact, you know, as you're aware, Eric, many advisors around former President Trump have often said to him, you know, let's just let it go, move forward. We got enough to talk about with the China challenge, with mass illegal immigration, inflation in the economy. Let it rest and just move on. And he's been persistent and consistent in reminding the nation what happened. Now, again, if you were in Democratic leadership, you would say, we just need to bury this. We need to move on. Let's not get people riled up again. Let's not get people agitated. And yet, by these recent actions, the two indictments that particularly pertain to the 2020 elections, they have ensured, these actors have ensured that the question of integrity in the 2020 election will remain front and center through 2024. They have shot themselves in the foot or head, however you want to describe it, in terms of ensuring that all of the evidence, the more recent information that's come out over the last couple of years that maybe did not get airtime, certainly did not get time in the courts 3 years ago, may be coming out in a wider scale than it ever was before.
So do we think, because I've heard different things on this, that as a result of them indicting Trump on, supposedly trying to overturn the election, I mean, it's so stupid, it's unbelievable, frankly, on so many levels. But just at the heart of it is this idea that they're accusing him of having done that. And does this mean, what I've heard, that this will allow Trump's defense team to bring out all of the evidence that we have hitherto not seen much of? In other words, that we keep hearing about it, but the news buries it, or they're not interested in it. You have a lot of judges that seem to be afraid to deal with the evidence, and so they say, oh, you've got no standing, we're not going to look at it, whatever. So we haven't really seen a lot of this, but is part of the miscalculation on the part of the Democrats in bringing these indictments, is part of that miscalculation that this evidence will be shown?
It's absolutely part of the miscalculation. And just to conclude the thought that I was expressing before is I actually don't believe it's the Democratic national leadership who's advocating for this. I think what is happening here is you've got these local prosecutors, local district attorneys in Manhattan, right here where we sit in the Southern District of New York, in Atlanta, who recognize that for their constituency, this resonates. This is a fundraising operation for them. They are a bit rogue, I believe, from probably what makes sense and what strategically the party would have wanted them to do. They see personal, individualized benefit from it. They're going to wreck the ship in order to achieve it. To answer your question, it will bring into debate, because certainly Trump's defense team is going to want to be able to bring all of this to bear, all of it into visibility, certainly in courts of law, but also in the court of public opinion. In other words, this is going to be the moment where we're going to be exposed to a number of things that weren't visible before, both in court and, again, in the media broadly.
So you just said a couple things here that are new to me. When you talk about, these prosecutors who are bringing these things, you're saying you just said that they're doing it for their own self-interest to raise money. So the folks who did this in Georgia, the folks who did this in New York, this is not part of some, according to you, part of some larger national strategy against Trump. That this is people operating on their own.
It could be. In other words, if you take my logic forward and you say this didn't make any sense for the broader anti-Trump Democratic coalition as a means to an end, because it is going to have the effect that I've described, which is to keep all of this in the spotlight over the course of the next year, I look to ulterior motives. And the one that I see, and you follow the money as always, which is that these district attorneys are supported by the radical wing of the Democratic Party, extreme left, extreme progressives, rabid anti-Trumpers, and have had fundraising bonanzas as a result of these actions that they promised that they would take, tweeted that they would take, and this obviously undermines their objectivity here, but now have taken against a former sitting president of the United States, something not seen before in the history of this nation, and frankly something that doesn't belong in the states or local districts. This is a federal matter, if it's a matter at all.
And how has it happened? Because I think a lot of us, like me, don't really understand how it would be possible. You'd kind of think that, don't we have laws that this kind of lunacy can't happen in America? How is it that you can have these people in these 4 states doing these kinds of things, turning the whole country upside down? What is going on there, or do you know? I mean, because it's confusing to me.
It seems to me a complete disintegration of our political and judicial system. And we've talked in other venues about the fact that we are in a season of the weaponization of everything. And we've hit a period where the gloves have come off, where restraint has been completely abandoned. We're no longer fighting within the ring, within the arena, the 4 corners that were set by law, by custom, by policy. It is a free-for-all. It is no holds barred. And frankly, conservatives have been on the back foot in that kind of combat for a long time. I think in this moment that it's changing. One of the things that I think was very interesting was the intentional provocation of these indictments. In other words, this was being used in part as bait to try to mobilize the MAGA base, the Trump base, to reenact or act out as it's perceived that was done on January 6th, to try to bait that same group into violence, into reaction, into something right now. That base is not taking the bait.
Well, first of all, they didn't take the bait on January 6th.
That's right.
Because whatever narrative they're forcing on us didn't happen. Every day that passes, we see more and more that it was the proverbial false flag operation, that the whole thing was a false narrative that keeps being pushed. We have people in jail. It's really so evil. It's unbelievable. But so you're saying that
I'm saying that if, by the
part
way,
of the calculation was to try to use these outrages to bait Trump supporters into some kind of action.
To provoke violence.
But then that makes it sound like it is a national strategy.
Again, I'm throwing out hypotheses here of things that they could both be true at the same time. In other words, the intention, if it is actually because they do believe that Trump can be convicted on these charges, which I find doubtful, highly doubtful. Nonetheless, perhaps they're true believers.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are always ancillary benefits. You calculate, what are we going to get out of this? What is it going to cost us?
Right.
One of the ancillary benefits is to try to provoke a reaction. Now note, to your point on the false narrative of January 6th, it remains remarkable to me that they've not been disabused of this idea that, for example, what is probably the best armed and well-defended part of the American populace, these conservatives, on so-called Insurrection Day, collectively forgot to bring their guns and weapons.
Right.
It's just as a reminder.
Whoopsie daisy.
If this is what it really was. Obviously, it was intended to be a peaceful protest against something that was perceived as a violation of their rights as citizens, and they were standing up, expressing grievance, which is one of the things the Constitution absolutely allows us to do as citizens of this country.
Look, even Naomi Wolf, who is no conservative and no Trump supporter, she wrote about this. That we have traditions in America of people protesting injustice. This is as basic as it gets. So for the rabid, Marxist, anti-American, Trump-hating left to suddenly decide, yes, You can protest and say everything, but not on this and not on this and not on this. That's out of the pit of hell. That is as anti-American as anything, and we need to be really clear on what is happening in this country, folks. This is evil in a way we've never, ever seen it before, and we need to be aware of it, and we need to fight against it, do everything we can, and talking about it and revealing what it is very important, which is why I'm talking to my guest today, Mike Wilkerson. You can go to stormwall.com. Don't forget, before we come back from the break, please go to metaxastalk.com and give to Food for the Poor. We really need your help. Metaxastalk.com. Please click on the banner. We're grateful to you. Thank you. Welcome back. Talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com, and I recommend that you find him at stormwall.com. Mike, you one of the things that we were going to talk about was the weaponization of everything, including the banks, to quiet people, to silence people, really to destroy liberty and the way of life that we've had in America, where the people are able to govern themselves and express themselves freely. Talk a little bit about that, the weaponization of banks.
So one of the things that happened immediately after January 6th was the FBI requested banking records from the big banks. That was provided without subpoena, without legitimate basis. But that was just the beginning. We've seen really across the world examples in the past several years that the banking system, financial system, banks and payment processors, the whole architecture of the financial world have been targeting conservative views, conservative political views, conservative religious views, right to life. And we've seen it all the way from the very elites of society, well-known, famous, well-known people, such as former National Security Advisor General Michael Flynn, who I know you know, and you've talked to him about this, whose family was targeted around these issues. Recently, Nigel Farage, who was the founder leader of the Brexit Party and a permanent thorn in the side of the British political establishment, was targeted by his bank, Coutts, in the UK. They sent him a letter saying, "We're sorry, we can no longer provide you with banking services." No explanation required. He stood up and protested. The CEO of the bank lied, reached out to the BBC and said, "Oh, it's because of commercial reasons. He didn't have enough money in our accounts." The BBC printed that story. A few weeks later, Nigel Farage finds internal documentation within the bank from their compliance department, finding an extensive document that pointed to Brexit, pointed to his affiliation and affinity for former President Donald Trump, his views on the Russian-Ukraine war, views on immigration, et cetera, as the sum total of the reasons why they wanted to sever the relationship from the bank. As soon as all this came to light, now it did result, the CEO of Coutts was fired, the chairman was fired, the CEO of the parent bank was all fired. But this shows you what is going on at the highest level. Now the parliament is looking into it, but it's not just high-profile people. We saw what happened to the Canadian truck drivers and anyone who dared to try to support them last year or a year and a half ago, whenever this was. They were cut off altogether. It's gotten so bad that recently, I believe in May of this year, 19 attorney generals from across the United States sent a letter to J.P. Morgan asserting that they were, in fact, discriminating against conservative political and religious views. 19 attorneys general gave illustrations from their own states of situations where this had happened, both to individuals but also to organizations, nonprofits, religious organizations that were supporting life, supporting other things, and of course Second Amendment issues as well. So this is happening around us, and the warning that I have been giving to Americans is you have to be aware this is going on, that it's not just those in the spotlight, people like Nigel Farage or General Flynn, but as we saw with the truckers, it can happen. And by the way, it does happen on a daily basis, anonymously, quietly, that people are getting cut off. You know of people to whom this has happened.
And what can we do about this?
Well, the first thing is to align. Find banks that do align with your values, maybe regional ones, smaller ones that aren't caught up in the global system, that aren't caught up in these issues around ESG and other things. Diversify, maybe you can, maybe have more than one bank, so you've got some options. Learn about non-bank alternatives. other places where you can store value.
A coffee can in the backyard with gold bullion in it.
Gold, crypto, other things
Well,
like
no,
this.
you know, in all seriousness, like a lot of people are onto this.
Yeah.
But if you're not onto this, folks, you need to be onto this. I realized that we need to raise money for a lot of projects we're doing with Metaxas Media. I rarely talk about it on this program, but I realized that the crowdfunding, I can't remember the name of the crowdfunding, you know, the one that shut down the truckers, that they are
GoFundMe, I believe.
GoFundMe, yeah, they're in bed with the devil. They can steal your money. And so we were thinking of trying to raise money there, and then I realized I can't do that. I cannot align myself with them because you can't trust them. If they don't like what you're doing, they can take your money. I mean, it really is so evil. So we went with Give, Send, Go, and Give, Send, Go does align with my values. So if you want to give to my projects, go to givesendgo.com/Eric. Give, Send, Go is one of the good guys, but we need to get the word out about who are the good guys out there. Where can I spend my money? Where can I invest my money? Where can I spend my money? Where can I give? Because when you bring this up, it's a chilling thing, Mike, that we're living in a day when, because of technology, the idea that after January 6th, the federal government could be asking for banking records and stuff, that all this stuff, it's just you got to press some buttons. That's a scary thing to me, that power has been aggregated in the way that it has.
We're living in an age of the panopticon, where government is now. We're already at the point where government is seeing and surveilling everything that we're doing. There was a lot of kerfuffle a week or two ago about this new identity company called WorldCoin, who wants to scan the irises to get information so that people can access the economy. And people are rightly creeped out by this. The issue is that it already exists today. Like, our government is already doing this. Think about going through the airport. Think about...
hang on one second. We're talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. We will continue this conversation. Lots more ahead. This is important stuff, folks. You can find Mike at stormwall.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, you were just bringing up the panopticon. In case people don't know what that means, pan just means everywhere, and opticon, optics, so that you can be seen from every angle. You're being surveilled. We're living in that reality, but there are things we can do about that, right? Like, I will not get clear at the airport because I don't want them to have my biometrics. I don't know if they'll use it against me, but there's a good chance they will if they can, and I don't like giving away anything. You know, I won't do 23andMe because I don't want China to have my DNA. The fact is that every time you turn around, people are giving you these like nice alternatives to give away all of this information. So what is your advice? Or maybe sketch out the problem first.
Well, it's a real dilemma, because when I said panopticon, as you said, it means that it's already everywhere. I don't believe it's any longer simply a choice about choosing one thing or the other. As you walk down the street, Eric Metaxas, there are cameras from all angles who are using biometrics, same thing that Clear uses, which happens to use either a fingerprint or an iris. They use facial recognition, broad patterns, mobile passport control, your bank, Touch ID on your phone, okay, is another form of biometric. It's everywhere already. And so the choice becomes, let's go from one extreme, the purist of saying, I'm not going to allow that to happen. Well, you have to live in a cave or in a cabin somewhere completely cut off from the grid, because otherwise this information is already being collected, being gathered. The technology genie is out of the bottle, so to speak. So we then end up in sort of this intermediate world of trying to make personal choices about whether we want to expand that field of knowledge, provide more data points or input. I'm not suggesting it's easy. That's why I say it's a dilemma, because I don't think there's an easy way out without complete isolation from the economy, from the culture and otherwise. So it's, and we've crossed that Rubicon. We're not going back. And governments won't allow us to go back. Imagine, Eric, just for a second, if by some utopian vision, the U.S. did renounce all of those biometric types of technology. Well, China's still using it. Our adversaries around the world are using it, and they're not only collecting it on their own citizens, but through all sorts of means, through travel, through TikTok, through otherwise, they're collecting it on American citizens as well. So the further dilemma is, if we were, as a government, as a country, to shut that sort of stuff down in the U.S., how would we not just be weakening ourselves against the powers of adversarial forces who are using it? This is an ugly set of choices. What you need is something that we don't have, which is someone who could say, right, we need the ability to recognize that you're a human, to recognize that you're a unique and specific individual human too, and yet at the same time provide you with anonymity and privacy. Those are three things. That is the golden ring, if we can call it that. And the issue, of course, is always the last one, because the intelligence services are diametrically opposed to the idea of the third, of anonymity, that you should have a right to privacy,
Right.
a right to sanctuary. This is the tension we're living in.
Right, and this is why the Patriot Act was a bad idea.
It was a terrible idea.
And we had many liberals like Naomi Wolf screaming about it. At the time, I naively thought, no, George Bush wouldn't be for anything that's bad. That's how stupid I am. I confess it freely. We had conservatives like John Zmirak screaming about the Patriot Act and the neocons and what they were doing. And it all happened. And people knew that, well, when the other side gets in power, they can use these things against you. That is what's happening now. So it seems to me that part of the larger picture is that we need people in Congress and in the Senate and in the White House who understand these things and who have the political will to do something about them. That's the challenge.
What's interesting to me, listening to you speak, it reminds me that, it was, let's call them the old school liberals, the 1960s liberals, who were the first to identify the rise of and danger of the secret government within the U.S. The fact that, hold on, all of a sudden there was this fourth branch operating in government that, by the way, scared presidents. Eisenhower, Kennedy, rightly, others were deathly afraid of the power of the CIA, the power of the deep state, and what it could do. Conservatives, for whatever reason, continued to have faith in their government, how it was operating, that all of these forces were somehow working for good in the Cold War and after. And unfortunately, to your point, it's only been lately that conservatives have begun to realize that those old school liberals were prophetic in their voice of saying, this secret government is dangerous and it is working against the interests of we the people.
Well, and again, this is why we need civics. I'm trying to get Richard Dreyfuss on the program to talk about civics. If you don't understand how America works, I wrote about this in my book, If You Can Keep It. I didn't really understand this until a few years ago. I really began to process that most of my life I haven't really understood how America works, how liberty functions, to really appreciate the rarity of what we have in America and understand the vigilance it takes to preserve it. For decades, many people kind of let that slide. And so you end up in a place where people that we haven't elected are in power. And again, we saw this, you mentioned it, but I mean, Eisenhower and Kennedy were awake to this. I mean, I think the CIA murdered Kennedy because he was ruffling these feathers. That's how sick it is, and that is 60 years ago.
Yes, and they did it because they had become accustomed to being able to do it in foreign countries. In
Right.
other words, the long list of CIA interference in countries around the world during the heights of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, it extends beyond 50 different countries, including coups and political assassinations. By the time 1963 came around, they were well practiced in these dark arts.
It's unbelievable. It's un-American, folks, and we have to undo it. Some people say it's draining the swamp. You can describe it however you want, but this stuff is at odds with what the founders gave us, the model of ordered liberty that the founders gave us, that's described so well by our friend Os Guinness. And we have to undo what has been done. And there's going to be a lot of pushback. We're seeing a lot of pushback right now. That's a big part of the war that we're in at present. We'll be back talking to Mike Wilkerson for final segment. In the meantime, folks, if you haven't yet, you need to go to metaxastalk.com, give to Food for the Poor. We need your help. You can text Eric to 91999. If that's easier, just text Eric to 91999, or you can call 844-863-HOPE, 844-863-HOPE. Welcome back. Talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, you and I last night touched on something off the air, something crazy but true. And I thought, let's mention this on the program. This is the final segment of today, so here's your chance.
Well, it just caught my eye a week ago because I thought it was so preposterous I couldn't believe it was true. But it turns out that in Minnesota, at the Minnesota Art Center, there is a taxpayer-funded exhibit which was described as a family-friendly demon summoning, family-friendly demon summoning, where children and families were invited to pick a demon that they could invoke and attract and trap to them.
This is something that, crazy Christians would make up. It couldn't possibly be true, except it's true.
So I look into it. And
In
Minnesota, taxpayer-funded money, in a public space. And it turned out that the exhibit that they were displaying was with a particular demon called Lilith, the empathic demon. And I looked at this, and something struck me about the name Lilith, and so I dusted off some old reading, and I remembered that this Lilith, was in the Babylonian pantheon of gods, was a she-demon, a very powerful one and very feared. Lilith was a succubus. Lilith was a demon whose tricks of the trade were to cause miscarriages, stillbirths, infant
I mean,
death.
it's like if there was a demonic power behind abortion, for example, this is what we're talking about. These are actual demonic powers. We don't need to get into it, but you're telling me that in Minnesota, they are making this seem friendly. Folks, what could be more wicked? What could be sicker than this, that in the United States of America, you have people who are basically apologists for the demonic, literally. And they called this demon Lilith the empathic demon, like empathic, your friend from the pit of hell.
And yet there's more. So not only was this demon associated with infant death, it also was associated with stealing of young children, with seducing men in order to use their seed to produce demon offspring. And again, to your point at a moment in the culture, how this is so true of all of these things. Now, it struck me that was all very, very coincidental and probably meant something more than what it intended. And then imagine my shock a few days later when I'm watching a review of the movie Barbie. And one of the things, and I know that for a lot of women, Barbie speaks to empowerment, it speaks to some aspirational, someone to look up to, etc.
That's what Mattel wants you to think,
That's
by the
right.
way. They paid for the movie, no joke.
But there's something very odd that goes on in the beginning of this movie, which is this sort of replication of the first opening scene of 2001: A Space Odyssey, except here in Barbie, the young girls are pushing, instead of monkeys, learning enlightenment from this obelisk that comes down. There are these young girls pushing around prams with dolls, baby dolls, that they're nurturing and taking care of, and they're made to look very sad about doing so. A giant Barbie emerges as if from the sky, this monolithic idol. And soon enough, these young girls are taking their babies and smashing their skulls against rocks and against each other.
This is in the movie Barbie, folks, not recommended. We've just got seconds left. Let's wrap this up and we can catch it
So
tomorrow.
just a quick wrap point is it turns out the origins of Barbie, as I looked this up, was from a German woman who found a model in a German sex doll who went by the name of Lil. Now, in German, Lil can mean a bunch of different things, including related to light and otherwise, but I, again, found this coincidence with Lil and Lilith from the origins of Barbie to be too deep and too strange.
Well, when you're smashing babies' skulls in a movie paid for by Mattel to sell Barbie dolls, it's just so creepy. I just wanted to end on an offbeat note, and I've succeeded. Mike Wilkerson, we'll have you back. We got lots more to talk about. You can find Mike at stormwall.com. Folks, don't forget, we need your help at Food for the Poor. Go to metaxastalk.com. Do what you can. Thank you. Folks, welcome back. I'm talking to Mike Wilkerson, been on the program many times before. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, you're complicated. You've written a number of books. Why America Matters: The Case for New Exceptionalism, highly recommended by me, who read it. Why America Matters. You've been in the financial industry for decades, and now people can find you at stormwall.com. You write often on financial things, but the other day when we were talking, we ended our conversation by talking about a bizarre thing that you read in the news, that in Minnesota, families were encouraged to, how did we put this, to summon a demon called Lilith, the empathetic demon. And we discussed this the other day. We don't need to cover it again. But the idea that we're living in a time where things are so dark. I mean, we talk about the weaponization of everything in our government against the people. We talk about all this kind of stuff. But then there's this spiritual dimension. And we talked about how this actually happened in Minnesota. And again, sounds made up, but it's not. You read it. It's real. And families were encouraged to be summoning a demon, as though this would be kind of a fun thing to do with the kids. And it really reminds me of the drag queen story hour stuff. It's like something dark and weird is being pushed by various forces out there. And you mentioned Jonathan Cahn. We both mentioned Jonathan Cahn. He's been talking about this, that when you, even Naomi Wolf was talking about this, that when you push God out, you don't get secularism. You get a vacuum that invites these demonic powers in. And so that's basically what Jonathan Cahn was writing about in his book, Return of the Gods. But it reminds me that there's nothing new. I mean, in the 60s, you had the West open the door to Hinduism and to all this stuff. I mean, the Beatles went to India, and they kind of were telling the whole world, hey, this is safe, this is fun, this is good, open your mind, transcendental meditation, yoga. And Hasbro created a board game, which was the Ouija board. And so there's nothing new. This is just kind of a new, more hideous iteration of what's been kind of bubbling along in the culture.
One of the things I cover extensively in Why America Matters is I remind all of us, because many of us have forgotten, but some Americans just don't know it, have never been taught. This nation was founded on an idea that there was a God in heaven whom we should serve, whom we should love, and that was the supreme devotion and obligation. And the pre-Revolutionary War generation, our so-called Puritan fathers, brought this idea that no matter what else, that we were going to, as a nation, serve the Lord God. Over time, even at the founding, the Constitution and elsewhere, this idea is still resonant. It still is absorbed in the American story. Really, all the way through the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln evoked it. We hadn't lost it at that point. You mentioned that really early in the 20th century, America began to be unmoored, disconnected from its foundational ideas, from the centrality of religion, the centrality of God in the life of the individual, but in the life of the nation. How did that happen? Well, we took it out of our government. We took it out of our schools. The entire reason the public school system had been established in the mid-19th century by Daniel Webster and others was this idea of we need a way to transmit to the next generation the ideals of our founding. Civic virtues, religious virtues, the things that made America great, that made America what it was. To take God out of public schools, to take God out of government, ensured that the next generation would grow up completely detached from this fundamental reality. Everything else derives from this essential of, is there a God in heaven or not? In other words, propositionally, and how one lives one's life and how the government behaves. You saw it begin to go amok in the 1960s, as you point out, that policies that were made in the 40s and 50s around prayer in schools, around the ability to have religious instruction, all of these things exploded in a mushroom cloud of deceit and lies and confusion. I think the thing that you have to recognize is how do we have these drag queen story hours for kindergartners funded by the state, funded by taxpayers? How do you have a demon summoning in a public art center in Minneapolis funded by taxpayer dollars? So we've completely lost any sense of right or wrong, up, down. Confusion abounds. And the only way we're going to get out of this is recognizing and coming back to the singular truth, the one truth, that there is one God.
Well, and the funny thing is, this is not opinion, this is not philosophy, this is fact. You cannot have the self-government and the liberty that we had in America without God. Now, the founders understood that. Those generations all understood that. They also understood the concept of religious liberty. You cannot force people to believe in God. You can't force people to believe that 1 + 1 = 2. If somebody wants to raise their family and say, we believe 1 + 1 = 3, it's a free country. You can't force people to believe what is true, but it doesn't change what is true from being true. And something happened, as you just said, but it took decades and decades. Abraham Lincoln prophetically said it when he was still a young man. He gave a speech to the Springfield Lyceum, I guess it was in 1838. He gave a speech where he talks about America, if it ever dies, must die by its own hand. We are going to let this happen to ourselves if we're not careful, because we've got it all, but only we could be so spoiled and so blessed that we would not recognize that we need to preserve it and fight for it. And so this has taken decades and decades and decades for a lot of these bad ideas to work their way into the system until we get where we are now. And to my mind, the church is guilty in a sense of participating in this process of secularization.
Well, there's no doubt. And by the way, what has happened hasn't just been sort of the abandonment of the authority of the religious or the spiritual view in life, in public life, in the public square. We're not just in this free-for-all where all ideas are out there and, to your point, open to be believed or to not be believed. Absolutely not. We've gone through a process of the tyranny of the minority where a small group of people said, no, it's not going to be a free-for-all. We're going to ensure that these views, religious views, are silenced.
Yeah.
And a materialistic, mechanistic view of the universe is going to be presented to young children. It was from there which derived everything else. So it wasn't that we had a level playing field. We were shut out.
And I want to be clear that, folks, this is, in other words, a lot of people behind this, they really thought they were doing a good thing. They basically thought religion is this kind of added on extra thing. We don't need that in government. We don't need that in culture. Let's just push it out and we'll get neutrality. But you don't get neutrality. When you push God out, when you get a secular world, you are inadvertently, whether you know it or don't, you are inviting in dark forces. So real secularism ends up in demon worship. Real secularism ends up in nihilistic, destructive, inhuman, anti-human policies. But they were, many of them, under this illusion that secularism is neutral. But as time has passed, we've come to see that it's not neutral. If you don't have a view, if you don't have the view of the God of the Bible, what's going to replace it? And what's going to replace it ends up, now we see, being increasingly dark, evil. In many cases, because we're seeing that, there are lots of people in America waking up and saying, I need to do something about this. I thought everything was fine, but it's not fine. My kids are being targeted by people who do not have my kids' interests at heart.
The madness of it all was the way this all transpired. When you lost a religious perspective, it coincided with this rise in the post-war world of the sort of therapeutic age, this idea of self, this idea of individuality that went beyond just sort of the American independence or liberty. The idea, it was really self-worship. And we're so inundated with it in today's culture that we can no longer even see it. In other words, we're in the middle of the tea that's been steeping in the culture for all these years. But this idea that there was nothing outside of myself meant all sorts of corruptions, right? I could lie, I could cheat, I could steal, as long as I could get what I needed to in the end. And then when you have an entire society operating on this basis, you've completely lost the anchor. You've completely lost any ability to navigate. It's like a ship without a rudder, without sails, without anything, just bobbing along in the ocean. But again, it's not just a neutrality. You point at it actually results in the opening of anyone who wants to accumulate power through dark forces, dark ideas, and to really raise a generation of young people, which is what this is all about, is indoctrinating the next generation to accept these ideologies that are very anti-God, anti-community, anti-faith, anti-American.
Well, we're going to go to a break, but I want to exhort you folks to go to find a church that understands this stuff and read the Bible every day. That is the way out of this. If you're going to some church that doesn't get this stuff, get out of that church. Also, I want to encourage you. We're doing a campaign with Food for the Poor. We need your help. Please go to metaxastalk.com. Please do anything you can. We're grateful to you. Welcome back. Talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, one of the things you talk about a lot is the financial world, the world of banking. How are we doing as a nation? Where do you see where we are right now?
You know, I'm very concerned, Eric. You know, there's this concept in aerial navigation called the point of no return. It's real simple, right? Which is point of no return is that point after which you don't have enough fuel to get back to where you are. And I believe that we've hit the point of no return in terms of our national economy. What do I mean by that? You know, we've been running in this century deficits every year. What does a deficit mean? That means the government's spending more money than it brings in. So you have revenues and you have your expenses. Well, we have not had a balanced budget since 2001. We had a number of crises that the government used to justify deficit spending. So in the last 23 years, we've accumulated $22 trillion of deficit over that time. During the two pandemic lockdown years, we added on $6 billion. We're still running at about $1.5 trillion a year of deficit spending today because of all these policies, the entitlements, the handouts, the Bidenomics, the support of the Ukraine. Now, why does that matter? Well, by definition, a deficit means you don't have revenue to pay for it. You're just spending money that you don't have. So over the course of this time, the American government, the United States government, I should say, has now, to this date, here in August 2023, accumulated $32.7 trillion of debt. It's starting to get to the point where, because interest rates are rising, so for many years during that time we had 0% interest rates effectively, where people could borrow, households could borrow, corporations could borrow, governments could borrow and keep funding these deficits. Well, now interest rates are starting at 5%. The Fed just raised rates over the last year to 5%. Well, what does that mean? Now, on that $33 trillion of debt, America is paying over $1 trillion a year just to service the debt. So we've created now this doom loop spiral where we have to keep printing more money, have to keep issuing more debt just to service the existing debt that we already have, with no prospect of ever paying it down.
Where does this go, Mike?
It goes to inflation. Well, let me back up. It could, in theory, go three ways. One, default. A nation can default on its debt. The U.S. is not going to do that. Okay, as the issuer of the global reserve currency, second biggest economy in the world, et cetera. That happens. You see that with small countries that are somewhat isolated. They can just repudiate their debt, walk away. That's one option. Two, tax it away. Well, at some point, when you overtax people, you see the pitchforks and the torches come out on the streets, and the political game is over. So politicians always end up in the same place. If you can't default and you can't tax it away, then you invoke a hidden tax. A hidden tax is inflation. Inflation is the secret tax, the hidden tax that deprives you and me and Americans all over this country of their purchasing power. But if you're the biggest debtor, if you're the one that owes the money, your nominal debt, as the inflation continues to go up and up, becomes less of a burden in real terms. And that is where we're going. And that is why I think it's important for Americans to understand we're not going back from this. We're not going back from a high inflationary environment, because the only way to actually change course would be for the United States government to stop deficit spending and actually start, cutting out literally trillions of dollars from the budget every year. It's not going to happen under any political leadership that we have right now. Maybe at some point in the future that would change. So the only remaining alternative is to secretly tax away the wealth of Americans and transfer it to the government through inflation.
Okay, that doesn't sound good. That sounds bad.
It's not good.
So you think that's going to happen? Where does that go eventually? In other words, I don't really I immediately think that, we can get rid of the Department of Education. We can get rid of, there are vast swaths of bureaucracy that are actually not doing anything good, that are costing us a lot of money. We could get rid of them, but you'd need the political will.
Or you just do it across the board. In other words, so that one side of the aisle
why
and the
do it
other.
why do it across the
Here's
board?
why.
Because then everybody suffers. In other words, why not actually cut out the fat, like the bureaucracy that is at war with the American people?
When I say across the board, I mean you take all of government's budget, whether it be for entitlements, for education, for military, and you say, all right, everyone, rather than us get in interminable battles between the left and the right over which program to cut, everyone takes the same amount of pain. 5%, whatever it is.
That's one solution, but I mean, we could defund the FBI tomorrow. They've become a weaponized organization. In other words, there are many, what we call the deep state, what we call the swamp. Tons of money is being paid to people who are actually not helping America. So don't you cut that stuff?
I completely agree, and I'm not saying you don't pursue political outcomes. What I mean by political is ones that are going to be divisive. Like that is something that I would support, that many Americans would support. We're going to have to go through a confrontation and a battle in order to bring that about.
And Kevin McCarthy does not have the guts to go to the mat for that.
But keep in mind, what you're talking about is discretionary spending. I just mentioned that of the $6 or so trillion in the federal budget, $1 trillion is going just towards interest. So unfortunately, we now have these fixed nuts that we're not going to be able to reduce.
Right. Well, that's different, but I'm still saying that we are spending so much money that it's astonishing. But so, I mean, you're giving us this picture. What do you think is going to happen?
So I think that it's going to get bad until it gets really bad, and then there will be some sort of crisis that forces a change. What is required? Again, you have to, at some point, stop deficit spending, stop printing money in order to fund the deficit. These require really either self-will and self-discipline that our politicians have not proven to have at any time in the century.
Thank you for not mentioning Kevin McCarthy by name, and we'll be right back. We're talking to Mike Wilkerson. Folks, got to remind you again, we need your help with Food for the Poor. We need your help, whoever you are. If you're listening, please go to metaxastalk.com, click on the banner, give what you can. These people need your help. Food for the Poor helps them, but you've got to help Food for the Poor do that. metaxastalk.com. Welcome back. We're talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com, where he talks and writes about all the things we're talking about right now and much more. Let's keep going. You're painting a very bleak picture. You're not the only one painting this bleak picture, which makes me realize this is a genuinely bleak picture. It's not just your point of view of where we're going. And what else? What is there to say?
One of the things that we were talking about, Eric, before the break was this concept of having passed the point of no return in regard to our national debt. And I called it the deficit debt inflation doom loop. And the basic idea here is because our government has been running deficit spending where it doesn't have revenue to fund it, spending trillions of dollars every year to fund these deficits, the only way that it can pay for it is to issue new debt. It's like if you don't have enough income in your job to support your lifestyle and you just find a bunch of credit cards and you go out and max them out, well, at some point that game runs out, and it also runs out for governments eventually. We've been able to do it for all these years. We've accumulated $32 trillion of debt because we had lots of people who were willing to lend to us in an environment where interest rates were close to zero. So it didn't really cost us a whole lot to keep raising enormous amounts of debt. Well, that game is now up. With inflation running hot, the Federal Reserve, the government has been forced to adjust the interest rate environment. And now, because interest rates are now not at zero but at 5%, that $32 trillion of debt that the government holds, this is just the federal government, by the way, states, municipalities aren't included, the federal government owes that amount, and they're paying $1 trillion in interest every year. Well, the only way to continue to spend the way they're doing is going to be through allowing inflation to run. And so what we were talking about before the break was the warning to Americans is you should expect that this inflationary environment is going to continue. Now, what troubles me about this is the impact that all of this is having on ordinary Americans. I mean, working class folk, middle class folk, people who live on retirees. You know, in that era of zero interest rates, if you were a retiree living on your savings, you were getting 0% income, which 0 times anything is always going to be 0. You couldn't live on it anymore. So that was affecting pensioners, affecting retirees. But the middle class and working class were also getting squeezed. We've talked about the deindustrialization of the United States. But what's happening now is that as prices are rising through inflation and across the board, if you look at what's happened in the 3 years since lockdowns and since the period of 2020, in aggregate, prices are up. Total CPI, something like just under 20%, I think it's 19%. Gas, fuel, 70%. Shelter, food, everything that we actually live on. Forget what the CPI index says. The things that you and I and Americans buy every day, gas, groceries, electricity, shelter, are all up way higher, way more than the headline values of CPI. Well, what does that mean? It means that just to maintain the same standard of living, Americans are spending 20, 30% more dollars than they had to 3 years ago. Wages haven't caught up. They're starting to catch up now, but they haven't caught up. And what's happened is that households across America, American families, have been going into debt in order to just maintain their same standard of living. So we're here sitting in August 2023. Just a few days ago, some new data came out that showed that American households owe $17 trillion of debt. It's the highest level ever. A lot of that's mortgages, like $12 trillion, but the other $5 or $6 trillion is non-household debt, auto loans, credit cards, student loan debt. Okay, we now have $1 trillion of credit card debt that Americans are holding. Because interest rates have gone up by the 5% we talked about, the average interest rate on a credit card is 21%, Eric. So if you or I can't pay off our credit card by the end of the month, we're going to get hit with somewhere between 21 and 29% interest. That compounding effect becomes another doom loop, a death spiral. You can't get out of that debt trap.
So this is all bad news. Is there any good news in here?
So the good news is...
There's got to be a pony in here someplace.
The good news is that with awareness comes power. With understanding what's going on, that Americans have to start making choices, you can avoid some of the worst consequences of this environment. I think the challenge for most people, for example, if you're a wealthy individual, you're now getting 5% of your savings. If you're the people that we've been talking about, most Americans, they don't have the ability to save because they're spending everything that they can. So the important, I think, lesson, or the important thing to take away is, a message that we have to get back, even in our households and in our governments, to financial discipline, to getting to a point where we're not overspending. You can see the reaction in popular culture, like Oliver Alexander's just blow-away hit song, Richmond, North of Richmond, that there's a real anger, a legitimate anger rising up in America as they see the effect of inflation, they see the effect of low wages, of deindustrialization. And to me, the first step is becoming aware of what's going on and taking steps to do something about it.
Well, and it's not like it just happened. Some people actually voted for Joe Biden. It's hard to believe, but there are people who voted for Joe Biden. There are also people who didn't vote, which enabled Joe Biden to get in the White House. There are people who don't want to talk about election fraud. We were not on this course to the extent that we are under Trump. We had energy independence under Trump. There's a lot to be said, but political leadership is kind of at the heart of this, and we in America believe that we can elect our own leaders.
We believe it, and then we realize that what we're faced with is this fourth branch of government, the secret government, unelected. What I'm encouraged by, and of course President Trump was the champion of this sort of defunding the deep state, draining the swamp, all the phrases. I am encouraged by the fact that if you look at all the challenger candidates on both sides, DeSantis, Ramaswamy, whoever it is, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For the Democrats, that they're all aligned on this. They won't agree that they agree or admit that they use different language to describe it, but what do they agree on? The need to dismantle the bureaucratic state, the need to go after this secret branch of government. And I think Trump is best positioned to be able to do that because of what he's been through, what he sees and what he knows. But the fact that all the other candidates are adopting a similar Trump-like platform tells you that he's onto something.
That is good news. More good news, folks. You can still give to Food for the Poor. In fact, we need you to do that. You have to go to metaxastalk.com, or you can text Eric to 91999. We really need your help. You can also dial 844-863-HOPE, 844-863-HOPE. Let me say it in Spanish, 844-863-HOPE. My American accent really messed that up. 844-863-HOPE. Welcome back, folks. We've been talking with Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. And Mike, we've been talking about a lot of things that they're difficult to hear and to see. What do you see in terms of hope? Because we need hope amidst the madness.
Well, one of the things that I'm most encouraged by is the awakening of America. That's not woke America. What I'm saying is that Americans who were slumbering through the years and in fact decades when a lot of this were happening, for the first time in their lives, are waking up to it, are seeing the overwhelming evidence, the effects of fake news, misinformation, disinformation from their own governments. They are seeing it. And in addition to being made aware, they're deciding that they want to do something about it individually. You're seeing a lot of examples, grassroots, local level, of people taking steps and taking actions to stand up, to resist, to say no, and resistance is power. I'm very encouraged, and I think this is what I believe you're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is to encourage more people to do it. We need to get our church leaders, our political leaders, our civic leaders to lead and to take action. But I'm very encouraged because I see that Americans are realizing, one, they have a voice, they can use it, and when they do, things change.
Well, it's funny because I've been focused mostly on the church. As I mention often, I wrote a book called Letter to the American Church because it's my sense that the church ought to be leading in this. And what I always say to people is if you're going to a church that is oblivious to this stuff, you need to get out of that church. But there are a lot of people who say, oh, well, I think, again, if you don't get the urgency of it, you're not going to do anything. People kind of act like, well, we've got a lot of time to turn this around. Actually, we don't. If you're not doing something about this today, you're part of the problem, folks, because we have the tiniest window. I often cite Bonhoeffer that he had a couple of years where he was trying to wake up the church to its duty, and they kind of thought, well, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. He's kind of a hothead. And we now know everything was not fine. And so it's one thing to say it's possible to get out of where we are. It's one thing to say it's possible for George Washington to win against the armies of King George III. It's possible, but you have to actually do it. You have to actually fight. You have to actually pray. And I don't say that lightly, like it's some, we have to pray because apart from God, I don't see hope, frankly. And obviously, I think that we have to have faith, and we have to pray, and then we have to put our faith into action. But the first thing we have to see is how bleak things are, and I still think there are a lot of people that kind of feel like, well, I don't know, I think we'll be fine, but we're not fine.
We're not fine. One of the things that strikes me as different about our era and the crisis that we're in, when you speak in reference to the church, is unfortunately another bleak fact is that we now have fewer and fewer people attending church, participating in any kind of faith community, and so they're not hearing anything in those contexts. As you go younger in age cohort, it's even more true. And so I think what I would say is that for any leader today, whether a church leader, religious leader, or otherwise, you have to be thinking outside the four walls of the church because that's where the people are. They're not, unfortunately, not inside today.
And by the way, when people say like there are few people going to church, I don't think that's a bad thing because I think there are a lot of churches where people were being fed nothing. And I think there's a reason people don't go to church if that's the kind of church options they have available, because it was not speaking to where they live. When the world is going crazy and your pastor pretends that it's not, I wouldn't waste my time in that church. That's just my opinion. Mike, it's just great to talk to you. I hope people will find you at stormwall.com. The book is Why America Matters, the case for a new exceptionalism. And I want to remind you finally, folks, we do need you to help us with our campaign at Food for the Poor. It is urgent, otherwise I wouldn't keep reminding you. You can go to metaxastalk.com, you'll see the banner, but we need everybody to step up to the extent that they can. God bless you as you give.